Thank you and good morning. I'm delighted to be here. And as Diana said, yes, I'm a teacher. I've always been a teacher. How many of you are or have been a teacher? Okay, there you go. So that's my orientation today, is coming from the perspective of a teacher. All right, so I'm focusing our talk today in order to kind of provoke us to think about what's going on in teacher education, teacher preparation, teacher training, and we'll talk a little bit about the terms that we use to try to decide how do we name this. And I've entitled my talk, with apologies to William Shakespeare, What's in a Name? So our first question has to do with what do we know about the changes in the teacher workforce currently, and how might that have implications for how we support the teacher learning process. What are the names, what are the terms, and what are the nuances associated with this work around how do we talk about teachers, how do we talk about their preparation, how do we talk about the policy, and how do we talk about the research? So let's start by talking about the teacher workforce and its potential relationship to how we think about supporting the teacher learning process. So, currently, you'll read the paper, you'll hear different things, and you might get the sense that there is this impending crisis in the teacher workforce for a variety of reasons. On the other hand, maybe there's a little bit of Chicken Little going on here. So let's look at sort of those two sides of the coin. So on the one hand, yes, there is decline in teacher preparation enrollment across the country. We know that that's the case right now. However, that decline is flat in some areas, and we have a surplus in teachers in a lot of other areas. Here in New England, we have a surplus of elementary educators. We know that. And we have areas of need where we're either flat or we're really struggling. We have an aging teacher workforce. There's been a lot of talk about what happens when, all of these baby boomers retire. Well, true, but we also need to look at that a little bit more closely. So we need to look at the teacher workforce in general and think about who's staying, as in staying in that classroom, in that school, in that community. Who's moving from classroom to classroom, moving from school to school, moving from district to district, moving from state to state, and who's leaving? Who are the leavers? We also know that there's a national K-12 student enrollment increase. However, in some states, there's a decline. So you have to be kind of careful when you look at, generalities versus more specifics. How is it contextualized? How are we looking at some of these issues? So in a lot of places, these teacher shortages that we're experiencing are framed as a problem. And sure, we can identify that there are problems there, but there are also opportunities. I know you've probably heard the much overused Chinese character for crisis that says that there's danger and opportunity together in crisis. So if we have a crisis, hopefully there's opportunity here. And if we frame it as opportunity, that may change the direction in which we move forward. All right, let's take a look at the teacher workforce. We know that the teacher workforce is getting larger, not just because our own population is getting larger, but that the actual relative numbers of teachers out in the workforce is growing significantly. That population of teachers is getting both grayer in the sense that we have a real peak of older teachers, significantly people who are well into the profession, and we also have a greener teacher workforce. We have another peak with very younger, very less experienced, and so there are these two peaks with kind of a trough in the middle. We also know that the teacher workforce is less diverse with respect to gender. There are more women in teaching now relative to men than there were previously. But we also know the teaching workforce is more diverse with respect to race and ethnicity. Another area that has gotten under a lot of scrutiny is the fact that the teacher workforce has been very consistent decade after decade after decade with respect to academic ability. And by the way, we know that the relationship between academic ability and teacher quality is anything but clear. But we do know that over time, the academic ability of teachers has not been particularly high, but it has been consistent. We also know that the teacher workforce currently is quite unstable. We have lots and lots of teachers moving from high poverty to low poverty schools, from urban to suburban schools, from poor schools to not poor schools. So there's a fair amount of instability in the teacher workforce. And there's very little research around these trends, which I would argue have pretty significant implications. So it's kind of like, are we in a back to the future place here with an older, very female workforce? So, and what implications does that have for the people that come into the system that we want to have engage in successful learning about teaching? All right. Similarly, we know that in our student population, the minority is becoming the majority. And the teacher workforce currently doesn't reflect, represent, or effectively support much of student, family, and community populations. I'm not saying that it's not happening, but we know that there are some areas where it's not. And so what do we focus on here? Here we come back to this idea of what's in a name. Do we focus on the workforce that doesn't reflect our students, that doesn't represent our students, that doesn't support our students? Where should our emphasis be?